The first time I saw a sold sign on my grandfather's land, I was standing in the parking lot of a hardware store with a box of fence staples in my hand, wondering how my wife had managed to put a price tag on my bloodline. My name is Nathaniel Brooks. I am 46 years old, and for most of my life, I believe there were certain things a man did not have to defend inside his own marriage. His name, his dignity, the graves he visited, the land his family had kept through drought, debt, bad years, and worse choices. I was wrong. It started with a phone call from my old neighbor, Henry Caldwell, a man who had lived off Route 74 outside Asheville longer than most people had owned their houses. His voice came through my truck speakers rough and confused while I sat outside McDowell Hardware, rain clouds gathering over the Blue Ridge like a warning. "Nathaniel," he said, "there is a sold sign on your grandfather's land." For a moment, I did not understand the sentence. Not because the words were complicated, but because they belonged to a world that should not have existed. My grandfather's land was 38 acres of pasture, pine, creek bed, and red clay road, tucked against the hills where morning fog rolled low and slow over the fence lines. It was where my father built the first tool shed with his own hands. It was where my grandfather taught me how to mend wire after a storm. It was where we buried my first dog under a white oak near the back trail, wrapped in one of my old blankets because I could not stop crying long enough to let go. That land was not an investment to me. It was memory with property lines. I drove there without buying the staples. The road out of town narrowed after the last gas station, curving past old barns, cow pastures, and mailbox posts leaning from years of mountain weather. By the time I reached the gate, the rain had started, light and cold on the windshield. And there it was. A white sign hammered into the ground beside the wooden entrance my father had painted dark green 20 years earlier, under contract. Below it was the name of Graham Fletcher Development, printed in clean black letters like the land had already forgotten who it belonged to. I sat in the truck with the engine idling, hands still on the wheel, staring at that sign until the letters blurred. I did not get out right away. A part of me was waiting for the scene to correct itself, for Henry to call back and say it was a mistake, for the sign to belong to the property next door, for common sense to return like a person who had stepped out of the room too long. But the gate was mine. The fence was mine. The road beyond it was mine. The betrayal, I would learn, had my wife's signature all over it. When I got home, Meredith was in the kitchen wearing a cream sweater and reading something on her laptop, calm as a woman checking dinner reservations. She looked up when I walked in, saw my face, and closed the screen halfway. That was my first confirmation. "Why is there an under-contract sign on the land?" I asked. She sighed before answering, not with shock, not with guilt, but with the tired impatience of someone who thought I was about to be difficult. "Because I found a buyer." The sentence hit the room without apology. I stood near the island, rain still on my jacket, trying to make myself hear her correctly. "You found a buyer for land that is not yours to sell." Meredith leaned back in her chair. "We are married, Nathaniel. You act like everything has to be divided into yours and mine when we are supposed to be building a future together." I looked at the framed family photo on the wall behind her, the one from our 10th anniversary, where we were smiling beneath string lights in the backyard. I wondered when building a future had become her phrase for selling my past. "That land came from my grandfather," I said. "And it has been sitting there doing nothing," she replied quickly. 38 acres of dead weight, while we keep talking about repairs, retirement, and college savings. Graham says the market is perfect right now. Cabin rentals, weekend retreats, mountain tourism. This is the kind of opportunity people wait years for. Graham Fletcher, of course. A local developer with polished boots, perfect teeth, and a talent for convincing people that heritage was just a word poor families used when they did not know how to monetize dirt. I took one slow breath and set my keys on the counter. I did not yell. I did not call her what the moment made me feel. I only asked the question that would decide everything. Which title record did he use? Meredith blinked. For the first time, confidence slipped from her face. "What?" I stepped closer, voice even. "The title record, Meredith. The deed chain. The trust documents. The restrictions. Which one did Graham use before he put a sign on my gate?" She looked away for half a second, and in that half second, I knew she had mistaken access for authority, ambition for ownership, and a tax record for the truth. I picked up my keys again, not to leave, but because I needed something solid in my hand. Call Graham, I said. Tell him not to spend the commission yet. The next morning, I woke to the smell of brewed coffee and the soft hum of the refrigerator, but instead of the comfort I expected, there was a tension in the air that made my chest tighten. Meredith was at the kitchen table, laptop open, reviewing emails with the intensity of a stockbroker on Wall Street. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the steam rising in spirals, and sat across from her, still feeling the weight of the sold sign on our land. My mind raced through every document, every signature, every conversation that could prove ownership. Meredith looked up briefly, a practiced smile masking any hint of regret, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth ground me, and decided to start calmly. Meredith, we need to review everything Graham Fletcher submitted, I said. She nodded, fingers poised above the keyboard, ready to pull documents, contracts, and property records, all polished and intimidating in their professional appearance. I began to trace the chain of title in my mind, recounting conversations with my father and grandfather, the legal nuances they had taught me over the years about property rights, easements, and deeds. Each detail mattered. Every omission could shift the balance. I asked her to print copies, organize the files, and sit with me as we dissected each paper. Hours passed with the rain lightly tapping the windows, the sky gray and relentless, reflecting the storm in my own thoughts. Together, we pored over the title, mortgage records, and county filings. There was a pattern, a series of minor oversights and misinterpretations by the buyer's legal team that I recognized immediately. This was the opening I needed. I explained to Meredith, step by step, what each line meant and where the discrepancies occurred, watching her expression evolve from confidence to concern. I realized then that this situation, tense as it was, required strategy and patience rather than confrontation. I made notes, highlighting critical points, and together we drafted a list of questions and clarifications for Graham Fletcher. By late afternoon, the rain had eased, leaving droplets sparkling on the porch railings. Meredith and I sat back, exhausted but focused, understanding that our next move would be decisive. I reflected on how property, history, and trust intertwined, realizing the importance of clear communication and shared diligence. In this quiet, intense moment, the battle over the land had transformed from a confrontation into a meticulous process of reclaiming control. The day ended with a sense of cautious optimism. We had the knowledge, the records, and a plan to challenge the sale, and though the air remained heavy with tension, there was clarity about the path forward. I knew that tomorrow, armed with facts and a calm determination, we would confront Graham Fletcher with precision and confidence, ensuring that the land, our heritage, and our future would be preserved, and that Meredith and I, despite the initial breach, were aligned in purpose and strategy to reclaim what was rightfully ours. By the time morning turned into afternoon, the neat stack of papers on the kitchen table had begun to look less like evidence and more like a confession nobody wanted to read out loud. Meredith sat across from me with her laptop open, scrolling through emails from Graham Fletcher, escrow attachments, buyer notes, and a clean-looking purchase agreement that had clearly been designed to move fast before anyone asked the right question. She had helped me print everything, but that did not mean we were on the same side yet. I could feel it in the way she watched me highlight sections, waiting for me to overreact so she could call me emotional, waiting for my attachment to the land to sound less reasonable than her numbers. Graham said the tax record was enough to start the process, she said, her voice careful but still defensive. I looked at the county tax printout in front of me, my grandfather's name gone, my father's name gone, my own mailing address listed beside a parcel identification number that reduced 38 acres of family history into a few square inches of government formatting. Enough to start a conversation, I said. Not enough to sell it. She crossed her arms. You keep saying sell like it was already done. It was under contract. There are contingencies. There is a sign on my gate. The kitchen went quiet. Rainwater dripped from the eaves outside, steady and patient. Meredith looked toward the window, avoiding the photo on the sideboard of my grandfather standing beside that same gate in a faded work shirt, one hand on the post, the mountains rising behind him. She had seen that picture for years. She had dusted around it, moved it during holidays, once even told guests it made our house feel rooted. Now she was acting like the roots were in the way. Nathaniel, she said, softer this time. I thought I was helping us. I almost wanted to believe that. It would have been easier than believing she had let Graham's promises turn my inheritance into a shortcut. Helping would have been asking me before you let a developer put paperwork on the table. Her face tightened. You would have said no. Yes, I said, and that answer would have mattered. She looked down then, and for one brief second the room held something close to understanding. Then her phone buzzed. Graham's name flashed across the screen, and the old certainty returned to her face like a door closing. She answered on speaker after I told her to. His voice came through smooth and warm. The voice of a man who had spent years selling mountains to people who wanted views, but not mud. Meredith, I just spoke with the buyer's attorney. We need Nathaniel to sign the spousal acknowledgement and confirm no objection before they release the next escrow deposit. I leaned back in my chair. Graham, I said. A pause. Then a lighter tone, a little too friendly. Nathaniel. Good. Saves me a call. Which title record did you rely on? I asked. He chuckled as if I had asked whether the sun would rise. County tax record, parcel history, preliminary title pull. Standard stuff. Your wife represented the property as available, and frankly, this is a very strong offer. That was not my question. Meredith looked at me, annoyed now. Graham's voice cooled by half a degree. The buyer's title company will complete the full search before closing. That is what contingencies are for. So you put an under-contract sign on land you knew had not cleared title. This time the silence was his. Small, but there. Nathaniel, signs are marketing. Do not turn procedure into a family feud. I looked at Meredith as he said that, because it was exactly the kind of phrase she had wanted to believe. Procedure. Opportunity. Future. Nice words used to step around a locked gate. Email me the full preliminary title package, I said. Not the summary. All of it. Graham laughed again, but now it sounded practiced. I'm not sure that is necessary. Then you should be sure the sale is not either. Meredith reached toward the phone like she wanted to intervene, but I shook my head once. Graham cleared his throat. I will send what I have. The call ended, and the kitchen seemed larger without his voice in it. Meredith stared at me, her expression caught between frustration and fear. You are going to ruin this. I gathered the papers slowly, aligning every edge before placing them into a folder. No, I said. I am going to find out whether there was ever anything real to ruin. That evening, I drove back to the land alone. The rain had stopped, leaving the red clay road dark and slick beneath my tires. I parked outside the gate and walked to the under-contract sign. Up close, it looked cheaper than it had from the truck. White plastic, metal stakes. Graham's phone number printed beneath the bold letters. Behind it, the pasture rolled toward the creek, mist rising from the low places, the white oak standing at the far edge like an old witness. I touched the gatepost my father had painted and remembered his voice telling me that land was not valuable because someone wanted to buy it. It was valuable because someone before you refused to sell it when selling would have been easier. My phone buzzed. Graham's email had arrived. I opened the attachment right there beside the gate, scrolling through the preliminary title summary until I found what was missing. No trust deed. No deed restriction. No trustee consent. Just the tax record and a chain that started too late. I felt the first true calm of the day settle over me. Not relief. Not victory. Something colder and stronger. They had built their claim on a page that was never the foundation. I called my family attorney, Eleanor Vance, before I got back in the truck. When she answered, I said, I need the Brooks family trust file, the original deed restriction, and the notarized trustee clause pulled from county records by morning. Eleanor did not ask if I was sure. She had known my father. She had known my grandfather. She only said, I wondered when this land would need defending. I looked once more at the sign in front of my gate. Tomorrow, I said, one document ends this. That night, the house felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were aware of the tension that had settled between Meredith and me. I sat at the dining table, files spread in front of me, the glow from the laptop casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Meredith had returned from her errands, her expression a mix of hesitation and curiosity, as though she was trying to gauge whether I had discovered anything that could shift the dynamic between us. Nathaniel, she said cautiously, I think we can still make this work. I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch long enough for her words to reveal their fragility. The evidence we had gathered, The lack of proper deeds and trustee consent had shifted the entire landscape of what had seemed an imminent loss. I could see her weighing her options, her mind running through every possible angle, every potential excuse or justification. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, leaves scraping against the siding in a whisper that sounded almost like counsel. I turned my attention to the files again, methodically checking each document against county records, notarized statements, and historical deeds, my focus unwavering. Meredith moved closer, placing a tentative hand on my shoulder, but I didn't flinch or react. This was not a moment for sentiment. "Look, Nathaniel," she began, softer now. Maybe I acted too fast. Maybe I didn't think it through. I let the words hang, analyzing their truth and intent, aware that any misstep could undermine the leverage we now held. We spent hours cross-referencing every entry, every signature, every conditional clause, until the room was littered with printed evidence of what could and could not be done. By the time the clock neared midnight, I had a comprehensive understanding of the legal landscape, the gaps and oversights that had been overlooked, and the leverage that could protect our family's interest. Meredith watched silently, a mixture of anxiety and respect crossing her features as she realized the meticulous detail with which I had combed through the history of our property. "We need to present this carefully," I finally said, "so there is no ambiguity, no room for challenge." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the weight of the realization that the simple act of thorough documentation and careful legal navigation had turned a potentially devastating mistake into a position of control. Outside, the wind continued its constant rhythm, a reminder that time moves steadily forward, that every decision, every action carries consequence. In the quiet aftermath, as we organized the files and prepared a coherent presentation for the attorney and the relevant parties, a tentative sense of alignment began to emerge between us. It was cautious, measured, but it was real. Meredith no longer spoke in terms of haste or impulsive action. Her words were deliberate, reflective, and an acknowledgement that the path forward required patience, precision, and a shared commitment to ensuring that the family's land, the legacy represented in each acre, remained secure. For the first time since the discovery, I felt a sense of grounded anticipation, a controlled readiness to address the challenges ahead without letting emotion cloud judgment, knowing that tomorrow would bring action, clarity, and the opportunity to assert the rightful stewardship of the property. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting long patterns across the hardwood floor where Meredith and I sat, papers neatly stacked, laptops humming softly as we reviewed the strategy we had planned the night before. I noticed her expression was more contemplative than defensive, a sign that the gravity of the situation was settling in, and she seemed to realize that our joint focus on the legal documentation and historical property deeds was not just an exercise in bureaucracy, but a necessary step to safeguard our family's interests. "Nathaniel," she began cautiously, her voice subdued, "I see now that rushing into decisions without verifying everything could have cost us everything." And I nodded, acknowledging her awareness, yet silently noting the importance of moving forward with deliberate action. We meticulously went through every record, every line of text, confirming dates, signatures, and conditions, our combined attention to detail creating a rhythm of methodical progress that was almost meditative, a stark contrast to the tension and uncertainty that had dominated previous days. As we cross-referenced historical records with current legal standards, I could see Meredith shifting from a posture of hesitation to one of active participation, her questions becoming more precise, her observations insightful, revealing an understanding that was both surprising and reassuring. And it became clear that this collaborative effort was transforming the dynamic between us, moving from conflict and mistrust toward mutual respect and accountability. By late morning, we had constructed a comprehensive, detailed summary that could withstand scrutiny from attorneys, notaries, or any party with interest in the property, and the act of laying out these facts in an organized, transparent manner gave both of us a tangible sense of control and readiness, a reassurance that the potential pitfalls and misunderstandings had been addressed before they could become obstacles. Meredith's posture relaxed slightly as she reviewed the summary, her eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and recognition that the Careful preparation was the most powerful safeguard against future challenges, and I realized that her shift in attitude was pivotal because our alignment now was not only strategic but emotional, reinforcing a shared commitment to the family's legacy. After hours of collaboration, we took a brief pause, coffee cups in hand, and silently acknowledged the progress we had made. The documents meticulously cataloged and cross-checked, the strategy solidified, and in that moment, the sunlight highlighted a subtle sense of accomplishment, a quiet validation that careful preparation and mutual engagement could transform a stressful situation into a manageable and empowering process. As we returned to the work at hand, refining the summary, preparing supporting exhibits, and ensuring that each detail was accounted for, the mood in the room was markedly different from the chaos of previous days, and we both understood that the clarity and diligence we had achieved today would be the foundation upon which any negotiations or legal actions would rest, providing a measure of security and confidence that had been absent before, a reassurance that, together, we could navigate the complexities ahead without letting emotion or oversight undermine the integrity of our family's interests. By late morning, the call from Eleanor Vance came in while Meredith and I were still seated at the dining table, surrounded by printed deeds, county maps, tax records, and the kind of quiet that only follows a night of realizing how close a mistake came to becoming permanent. Eleanor's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it, the same steel I remembered from when she helped my father settle my grandfather's estate years earlier. "Nathaniel," she said, "I have the trust file." I looked across the table at Meredith. Her hand paused over the stack of papers, and for once she did not try to speak first. "Tell me," I said. Eleanor drew a slow breath. The 38 acres were transferred into the Brooks Family Irrevocable Land Trust in 1998. Your grandfather was the original grantor. Your father served as trustee until his death. You are the current beneficiary, but the independent trustee is still required for any sale, transfer, subdivision, commercial lease, or development agreement. Meredith's face changed slowly, as if every word was removing one plank from the bridge she had trusted Graham to build. I closed my eyes for half a second, not in relief, but in remembrance. 1998. I was 19 years old then, still young enough to think land was simply where family gathered, not something that needed legal armor. My grandfather had already been sick, moving slower, speaking less, but one afternoon he had taken me to the back fence line and told me, "Some people will see these acres and think they found money. You remember they found us." I had not understood the full weight of that sentence until now. Eleanor continued, "There is also a deed restriction recorded with the county. No sale can proceed without certified trustee consent and beneficiary acknowledgement. The preliminary title package Graham sent you is incomplete." I opened my eyes and looked at Meredith. She was staring at the table, her mouth slightly parted, the confidence from the day before gone. "Can you send certified copies?" I asked. "Already requested from the county clerk. I will have scanned copies within the hour and physical certified copies by tomorrow morning. I recommend we notify the escrow agent immediately and demand a title hold." "Do it," I said. Meredith looked up then. "A title hold means what exactly?" Her voice was smaller, but not innocent. I answered before Eleanor could. "It means the transaction stops moving until they explain why the most important ownership document was missing." Eleanor added, "And if any party represented the property as freely transferable without reviewing the trust, that creates a serious problem for the deal." The call ended with a plan, formal notice to Graham, the buyer's attorney, the escrow agent, and the title company by 5 o'clock. I set the phone down and let the silence return. Outside, the rain had cleared, and sunlight was beginning to push through the clouds over the pasture beyond our backyard. The same pale mountain light that used to fall across my grandfather's hands when he tightened fence wire. Meredith folded her arms around herself. I did not know about the trust. I looked at her for a long moment. "You did not ask." She flinched, but she did not argue. "That was something. Not enough, but something. Graham said spouses usually have claim to property acquired during marriage or held for the household," she said. "And you wanted him to be right." Her eyes glistened. "Yes." The honesty landed hard because it was plain. She wanted the sale. She wanted the money. She wanted the version of our future Graham had painted with cabin rentals, development checks, and the kind of lifestyle she thought 38 acres of red clay could buy. What she had not wanted was the story underneath the land, because stories slowed down ambition. I stood and gathered the county maps into one folder. I am going to see the land. Meredith rose quickly. I will come with you. I shook my head. Not today. Her face tightened. Nathaniel, I said I did not know. Not knowing was part of the problem, Meredith. Today I need to stand there without hearing how we can still turn this into an opportunity. She looked down, absorbing the boundary like it had weight. I drove out alone, past the hardware store, past the church with the white steeple, past the split-rail fences darkened by rain. When I reached the gate, the under-contract sign still stood there, bright and arrogant against the wet grass. I got out, boots sinking slightly into the red clay, and walked to the fence line. The air smelled of pine, damp soil, and creek water. Beyond the gate, the pasture rolled toward the hills, quiet as if it had never been dragged into anyone's paperwork. I placed one hand on the post my father had painted and thought about the trust deed sitting in Eleanor's office, about my grandfather signing documents most of us never appreciated because we thought love alone could protect what mattered. He had known better. Love needed paper sometimes. Legacy needed signatures. Boundaries needed to be recorded where ambition could not erase them. My phone buzzed. A message from Eleanor appeared with the scanned trust deed attached. I opened it beside the gate, and there it was, the one document they had missed. Brooks Family Irrevocable Land Trust, notarized, recorded, and still standing. I looked at the sign, then at the land behind it, and for the first time since Henry's call, I felt my breathing steady. Graham had a buyer. Meredith had a plan, but my grandfather had left me a shield, and tomorrow, I was going to lay it on the table. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window, coffee cooling in my hands, and Meredith at the table with her laptop open, her brow furrowed as she stared at the numbers she had been compiling. Nathaniel, she began cautiously. I tried to call Graham, but he isn't answering. I shook my head slowly, not in frustration but in recognition that this pause, this quiet, was the moment we had been waiting for. Every email, every document, every phone call from the previous week had led to this point, and now it was the land itself that needed attention. Then we proceed with caution, I said. Meredith leaned back, her chair scraping slightly against the floor, and let out a soft breath. We have the trust document, I reminded her. We know what we're dealing with, and we know what cannot be overlooked. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, scanning each for the signatures and notarizations that had been missing before, ensuring nothing would slip through unnoticed this time. Outside, the weather shifted subtly, clouds moving over the rolling hills, shadows stretching across the pasture, a reminder that time moved in its own rhythm, indifferent to human urgency. We walked together toward the property line, boots crunching softly on the gravel driveway, and I could see the tension in Meredith's shoulders, the way her fingers gripped her tablet like a lifeline, the anticipation of the unknown pressing upon her. It's surreal, she admitted quietly. Seeing it now, knowing everything could have changed if we had missed one detail. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The land behind the gate seemed larger, more commanding than it had appeared in the photos, the grass swaying in the morning breeze, the creek glinting under the sunlight like a silver ribbon, all under the watchful eyes of the trees at the perimeter. This is more than just property, I said, my voice steady. It's history, it's legacy, and it's proof that diligence and patience pay off. Meredith looked at me then, eyes wide, realizing the gravity of the moment, the culmination of careful steps and unforeseen obstacles, the intersection of ambition and responsibility. We walked slowly along the edge, examining boundary markers, the fence posts worn but firm, imagining how previous generations had stood here, measured the land, made decisions that would echo decades later. I could sense Meredith's mind racing, calculating possibilities, reconciling the ideal she had envisioned with the reality that meticulous attention and legal verification had now defined. The air was crisp, carrying scents of damp earth and pine, and for a moment, all the noise, the calls, the threats of losing the property, faded into the background. Here, in the quiet, the land was ours to understand, to respect, and to protect. I turned toward Meredith, signaling that this was the point where theory met reality, where strategy would guide actions, where every step, every signature, and every consultation mattered more than any wish or assumption. "We start today," I said firmly, "by documenting everything, confirming every detail, ensuring that no claim can override what is legally and rightfully ours." Meredith nodded, her expression a mixture of determination and newfound respect for the process, for the weight of responsibility that came with ownership. Together, we began walking the perimeter, taking notes, photographs, marking points for the surveyor, aware that every move was a step towards securing the property, preserving the legacy, and validating the trust that had been nearly overlooked, but which now formed the foundation for our next decisions. By early afternoon, Eleanor's formal notice had reached everyone who thought the deal was already rolling downhill too fast to stop. Graham Fletcher received it first, then the buyer's attorney, then the escrow agent, then the title company, each email carrying the same clean attachment: the Brooks family irrevocable land trust, the notarized deed restriction, and the trustee consent requirement they had somehow failed to include in their convenient version of the truth. I was at the land when Eleanor called to confirm delivery, standing near the old white oak at the back trail, where the grass grew taller and the creek made a low, steady sound over stones my grandfather used to call older than our names. "Escrow has placed a hold," she said. "The buyer's attorney wants a meeting tomorrow morning." I looked across the 38 acres, past the fence line, past the gate where Graham's under-contract sign still leaned in the wet ground like a bad idea pretending to be official. "Good," I said. "Who asked for the meeting?" "Their side did. Graham is still arguing that the trust may not restrict Meredith's spousal interest." I almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. Meredith never had a spousal interest in trust land. "Correct," Eleanor said. "But people who skip documents often try to argue feelings when the law stops helping them." After the call ended, I stayed beneath the oak a while longer, letting the quiet remind me why I had not let anger run the first day. Anger would have made this about Meredith. Paper made it about ownership. History made it about duty. When I returned home, Meredith was waiting in the living room with her phone in her lap, her face pale in the afternoon light. "Graham called," she said. "I set my folder on the coffee table. I figured he would. He said you are overcomplicating this to punish me." I looked at her, and for the first time since the sign appeared, I saw that she was no longer repeating his words with certainty. She was testing them against what she now knew. "What did you say?" I asked. She swallowed. "I told him I should have asked for the trust documents before I signed anything." That answer did not erase the damage, but it changed the air in the room. "And he said I was letting you make me feel guilty over in used land." The phrase hit exactly where he intended it to, but it sounded weaker now that it had to stand beside my grandfather's trust deed. "Do you still think it is in used?" I asked. Meredith looked toward the hallway, where the framed black and white photo of my grandfather stood on the side table. She had avoided looking at it all week. This time, she did not. "No," she said quietly. "I think I did not know how to measure what it was being used for." The honesty was late, but it was real enough to make me pause. She stood and walked to the window, arms folded, looking out at our backyard as if she could see the mountain land beyond it. "I wanted the money," she said. "I wanted the kind of future Graham described. A better house, less debt, maybe a chance to stop feeling like we are always almost there." I did not interrupt. Confessions are worth more when they are not pulled apart too quickly. "But I also wanted to prove I could make something big happen," she continued. "Real estate has been part-time for me. Small listings, small commissions, people treating me like I am dabbling." Graham made it sound like I had found the deal that would change how everyone saw me. I thought about her sitting across from Graham, hearing numbers so large they turned her caution into impatience. I understood the temptation. Understanding was not the same as excusing. "So you used my land to make yourself feel bigger," I said. Her shoulders dropped. "Yes." The room went quiet. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street, ordinary and rude against the weight of the conversation. Meredith turned back to me. "What happens tomorrow?" "We go to Eleanor's office. Graham, the buyer's attorney, escrow, title, and the independent trustee will be there or on conference call. Eleanor lays out the trust deed. The title company explains the hold. The buyer decides whether they want to fight they cannot win." "And me?" she asked. I held her eyes. "You sit there and listen." She flinched, but she nodded. "Do I speak at all?" Only if someone asks what authority you believed you had. Her face tightened with shame, but she did not argue. That mattered. The next morning arrived clear after days of rain, the mountains sharp in the distance as we drove toward downtown Asheville. Meredith sat beside me in silence, her hands folded in her lap. No laptop, no sales folder, no bright pitch prepared. Eleanor's office was in an old brick building with tall windows and floors that creaked under polished shoes. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Graham arrived 5 minutes late, wearing a navy blazer and a confident expression that looked rehearsed in the elevator. The buyer's attorney was already seated with a tablet open. The escrow agent had a folder marked Hold Notice. The title officer joined by video call. Eleanor placed one sealed packet on the table and did not open it immediately. She let everyone see it first. That was her way. A good attorney knows timing. Graham smiled at Meredith like they still shared a secret. She looked down at her hands. He noticed. His smile thinned. Eleanor began calmly. This meeting concerns the attempted sale of 38 acres held under the Brooks family irrevocable land trust. Before any further discussion of price, escrow, or buyer expectations, we need to address authority. Graham leaned back. The property appears on county tax records under the Brooks mailing address, and Mrs. Brooks represented that the family was prepared to sell. Eleanor opened the packet, removed one certified document, and slid it across the table. The paper made a soft sound against the wood, but everyone heard it. County tax records do not override recorded trust ownership, she said. The buyer's attorney leaned forward. The title officer on the screen stopped typing. Graham's eyes moved across the page, and I watched the first real crack form in his confidence. Eleanor tapped one clause with her pen. No sale, transfer, subdivision, development agreement, or commercial lease may proceed without independent trustee consent and beneficiary acknowledgement. Neither exists. The room went still. Meredith stared at the document like it was the missing page of her mistake. Graham cleared his throat. This may complicate closing, but it does not necessarily void the contract. The buyer's attorney looked up from the deed. It absolutely prevents insurable title as presented. The escrow agent closed her folder halfway. Escrow remains on hold pending cure or cancellation. Graham's face changed color by degrees. Eleanor looked at him over her glasses. There is no cure without trustee consent. The trustee is present by phone and has already indicated no consent will be provided. The speakerphone lit up, and the trustee's voice came through, dry and final. Correct. No consent. That was it. No dramatic speech. No shouting. One document. One clause. One voice on a speakerphone, and the deal Meredith had tried to push through began collapsing under the weight of the truth it had skipped. I looked at my wife. She did not look at Graham. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw her understand that she had not nearly sold dirt. She had nearly sold something guarded by people who had loved me before she ever knew my name. The room did not erupt after the trustee refused consent. That was what made the moment unforgettable. Graham Fletcher did not shout. Meredith did not break down. The buyer's attorney did not throw up his hands. Instead, everyone looked at the document on Eleanor Vance's conference table as if it had quietly removed the floor beneath the deal, and the silence that followed felt more final than any argument could have been. I sat beside Meredith with my hands folded, watching Graham search for a path through language that had already closed every door. His polished confidence had depended on speed, pressure, and the assumption that nobody would drag the old records into daylight. But the certified trust deed sat between us now, notarized, recorded, and patient. It had waited 25 years to do exactly what my grandfather intended: stop someone from converting bloodline into leverage. The buyer's attorney adjusted his glasses and looked toward Graham. My client cannot proceed without insurable title. If trustee consent is unavailable, the purchase agreement cannot close as drafted. Graham leaned forward, his voice still smooth but thinner now. Then we amend. We extend. We work with the family. Eleanor did not move quickly. She closed one folder, opened another, and slid a copy of the deed restriction beside the trust document. There is no family authority to amend this outside the trust terms. Mrs. Brooks did not have authority to bind the trust, and Mr. Brooks did not provide beneficiary acknowledgement. Meredith's face tightened at the word authority. She stared at the table, and I could tell the language hurt because it was clean. It did not call her greedy. It did not call her careless. It simply stated what she had not had the right to do. Graham turned to her then, trying one last time to pull her back into the story he had sold her. Meredith, you told me Nathaniel would come around once he saw the numbers. I felt her inhale beside me. For a second, I remembered the kitchen, her saying we should stop living small, her eyes bright with the idea of a future purchased by land she had not stopped to understand. She looked at Graham, and this time she did not borrow his confidence. I told you what I wanted to believe, she said quietly. The sentence changed the room, not because it fixed anything, but because it stripped his argument of its most useful witness. Graham's jaw tightened. You signed the listing authorization. Eleanor looked up. A listing authorization signed by a non-owner does not transfer authority over trust property. The title officer on the video call added, and it does not cure the title defect. Graham's face went still, the way a man looks when charm finally runs out of places to stand. The escrow agent typed briefly, then spoke in a practical tone that cut through every emotion in the room. Given the trustee's position and the recorded restriction, escrow will remain suspended pending written cancellation or lawful cure. No funds will be released. The buyer's attorney leaned back. I will recommend cancellation. There it was. Not victory. Not revenge. Just the sound of a deal dying because one missing document had become the only document that mattered. Meredith closed her eyes for half a second. I did not reach for her hand. That might have looked kind from the outside, but sometimes kindness becomes another way of preventing a person from feeling the consequence she created. She needed to sit in that chair as herself, not as a wife being rescued from embarrassment. Graham gathered his papers too quickly, the edges misaligned in his folder. This is unfortunate, he said. Unfortunate for whom? I asked. My voice was quiet, but everyone looked at me because I had barely spoken since the meeting began. Graham forced a smile. For everyone. There was a significant opportunity here. I looked at the trust deed, then at him. There was a significant assumption here. His smile disappeared. I continued, keeping my tone even. You saw 38 acres near Asheville and thought the only thing standing between you and a development plan was my sentimentality. You were wrong. What stood between you and that land was my grandfather's signature. Eleanor's eyes stayed on her notes, but I could feel her attention sharpen. Graham looked toward the buyer's attorney, perhaps hoping someone would object to the emotion in the room. No one did, because emotion had not stopped his deal. The document had. The buyer's attorney stood first, closing his tablet. We will issue a formal notice after speaking with our client. The escrow agent followed. The title officer disconnected after confirming the hold would remain. One by one, the room emptied until only Graham, Meredith, Eleanor, and I remained. Graham paused at the door, looking back at Meredith with frustration he no longer bothered to hide. You should have made sure he was ready before you brought me into this. Meredith flinched, but she did not answer. I did. She should have made sure she had the right before she brought anyone into this. Graham looked at me, then at the sealed packet still on the table, and for once he had nothing clever to say. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Meredith sat very still. Eleanor gave us a moment before speaking. Nathaniel, I will prepare a demand for cancellation of all listing and purchase documents, removal of signage, and written confirmation that no further marketing will occur without trust authority. I nodded. Do it. Meredith finally turned toward me. Her face was pale, not with fear exactly, but with the understanding that she had been standing on a story too thin to hold her. I am sorry, she said. I looked at her for a long moment. The apology was necessary. It was also not enough. You are sorry the document existed, I said, or you are sorry you tried to sell the land before you knew what it was? Tears filled her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. The second, I wanted to believe her. Maybe part of me did, but belief had to move slower now. Trust, like land, needed boundaries recorded in more than words. Eleanor placed the certified copy back in its folder and slid it toward me. Keep this close, she said. I took it with both hands. The paper felt heavier than it looked. When Meredith and I walked out of the building, downtown Asheville was bright with afternoon sun, tourists moving between cafes, music drifting from a street corner, the world carrying on as if my family's land had not just been pulled back from the edge of someone else's plan. Meredith stopped beside the truck. Can we go there? She asked. I knew where she meant. I looked toward the mountains rising beyond the rooftops. "Not together," I said. Her face tightened, but she nodded, accepting the boundary without trying to bargain with it. I drove out alone, the certified trust deed on the passenger seat. By the time I reached the gate, the under-contract sign was still there, leaning slightly in the wind. I did not remove it yet. Not before the formal cancellation. Not before the paper trail was clean. My grandfather had taught me that doing things right mattered most when anger made shortcuts tempting. So I stood in front of the sign, looked past it to the pasture, the creek, the white oak, the road my father used to grade after hard rain, and let the quiet settle around me. Graham's claim had cracked. Meredith's certainty had collapsed. The buyer was stepping back, and the land, untouched by all their paperwork, waited behind the gate like it had always known the truth would find its way home. As the morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse, I could feel the tension lingering like a heavy fog over the room. Meredith's hands folded on her lap, her eyes tracking every movement of Graham Fletcher as he shuffled papers with the last threads of confidence he could muster, and I sat silently beside her, knowing that the document Eleanor had handed me yesterday held all the weight it needed to turn assumptions into reality. Graham began with a rehearsed cadence, citing clauses and prior agreements, his voice steady yet betraying the faint tremor of uncertainty that only comes when a strategy is unraveling faster than expected. Meredith's face remained composed, but the tightness at her jawline hinted at the storm of thoughts running behind her calm exterior, and I could see her trying to reconcile the betrayal of misplaced trust with the reality of the law, which never bends to sentiment, only to document it. Authority. The trustee, Eleanor, sat with her arms crossed, a neutral observer whose eyes flicked between us all with calculated precision, signaling that patience and timing were her allies. And every pause she took seemed designed to amplify the gravity of the situation, making Graham's arguments feel hollow, his promises fragile. I could sense the room's atmosphere shifting as the certified deed of record was placed squarely in the center, its presence silent yet deafening, reminding everyone that some truths cannot be ignored, that some rights cannot be overridden by ambition or misinterpretation. Meredith's gaze softened for a moment as she glanced at the paper, a mixture of relief and recognition washing over her, acknowledging that the obstacle she had feared was not her failure, but a protective boundary established by foresight and diligence. And Graham's eyes darted between the deed and Eleanor, seeking a loophole, a misstep, a fraction of doubt to exploit, but the meticulous records left none. The buyer's attorney, observing the interplay of control and authority, adjusted his glasses and noted pragmatically that the agreement could not close as drafted, highlighting the disconnect between expectation and enforceable reality, which left Graham with diminishing options, each one collapsing under the certainty of proper documentation. I felt Meredith exhale, the tension of uncertainty giving way to understanding, and the realization that actions taken without full authority have consequences that are not mitigated by intention alone. Eleanor finally spoke, outlining the formal steps required to cancel any unauthorized listing and confirming that the land could not be sold without proper trust consent. And in that moment, the air seemed to clear as the legal and moral frameworks aligned, showing that adherence to documented rights ultimately prevails over expediency and manipulation. As we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave, I could see Meredith's posture shift subtly, the weight of the encounter settling into a firm resolve, and the understanding that lessons of trust, boundaries, and patience are often learned in the presence of unyielding facts, not arguments. Outside, the city moved on unaware, streets bustling with life. But for us, the certified deed remained a beacon of order, a reminder that meticulous preparation, attention to authority, and respect for process are the cornerstones that protect what is rightfully ours. And as we stepped into the daylight, I felt a calm certainty that the land, the trust, and the lessons learned would endure long beyond the echoes of this confrontation. The courtroom had quieted into an expectant hush, the echo of the previous exchange still lingering in the high ceilings, and I could see Meredith shift slightly, her hands resting firmly on the polished wooden bench, a silent display of composure as Graham Fletcher rearranged his notes, with the subtle frustration of someone who realizes that control is slipping away. The air was dense with anticipation, and every glance at the certified document placed on the table by Eleanor carried weight. Far beyond the printed words, it was a symbol of authority, a boundary no amount of argument could cross, and I felt a mixture of tension and relief as the layers of misunderstanding, miscommunication, and misappropriation were about to be dissected with precision. Graham spoke with a cadence meant to assert dominance, but the clarity of the deed's terms and the presence of a neutral yet observant trustee stripped his words of power, revealing the thin veneer of influence he thought he held. Meredith's expression remained steady, yet I could perceive the careful calculation behind her eyes, each flicker indicating the internal balancing of hope, strategy, and the cautious optimism that comes with a legal safeguard firmly in place. Eleanor's observant gaze cut through the tension, measuring reactions, timing interjections, and ensuring that the procedural course was maintained with unyielding accuracy. Her demeanor calm, yet commanding, and I sensed that her presence alone provided a framework of fairness and order that none could disrupt without consequence. As each paragraph of the deed was read aloud, the room seemed to shift. The authority of documented law pressed against the assumptions of entitlement, and Graham's body language betrayed the silent recognition that his maneuverings had been anticipated, that every loophole he hoped to exploit was already accounted for, every potential misstep nullified by prior diligence and preparation. Meredith's eyes briefly met mine, a silent acknowledgement that the protective measures had worked, that the layers of verification, the attention to detail, and the foresight employed to safeguard the property were now vindicated, and I could feel her release a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The legal team emphasized compliance, responsibility, and the irreversibility of actions taken without proper authorization, highlighting the contrast between intention and enforceable rights, and in doing so, reaffirmed the foundational truth that proper procedure and thorough documentation preserve what is legitimately ours. As the session concluded, we gathered our materials, the deed secure and the lesson clear, and walked into the daylight, the hum of the city around us unaware of the resolution achieved within those walls, while Meredith's posture reflected the solidification of her position, her understanding of accountability, and the quiet triumph of truth meticulously documented and unassailable. By the time the formal cancellation notice arrived 2 days later, the house was quiet in a way that felt different from the silence after an argument. This quiet had weight, but it also had shape. Eleanor Vance emailed the signed cancellation from the buyer's attorney just after 8 in the morning, followed by escrow confirmation, title company acknowledgement, and Graham Fletcher's written agreement to remove all marketing materials from the property by the end of the day. I read every line twice at the dining table, while Meredith stood near the window, holding a mug of coffee she had not touched. The morning sun stretched across the floorboards, and for the first time since Henry Caldwell's phone call, I did not feel like the land was being pulled away while I stood there explaining why it mattered. "It is over?" Meredith asked. I closed the laptop halfway. "The sale is over." She heard the difference. Her face lowered slightly, not enough to hide, just enough to accept that a contract dying did not repair what had been damaged in our marriage. "And Graham?" she asked. "He removes the sign. Eleanor sends a warning letter. If he markets the land again without trust authority, we take formal action." Meredith nodded, then looked toward the hallway where my grandfather's photograph sat on the side table. She had been looking at it more often since the meeting, not with the casual familiarity of someone passing furniture, but with the discomfort of a person finally realizing a picture can witness you. "I want to apologize to him," she said softly. I followed her gaze. My grandfather stood there in faded black and white, one hand on the old gate, mountains behind him, his face lined by weather and decisions I had never fully understood until this week. "He is not the one you have to live with," I said. Meredith turned back to me. "I know. We drove to the property separately that afternoon. I asked for it that way, and she did not argue." The drive out of Asheville was bright after the rain, the Blue Ridge clear in the distance, fields opening wide beyond the last rows of houses. When I reached the gate, Henry Caldwell was already there in his pickup, leaning against the door with his cap low and his hands folded over his stomach. The under-contract sign was gone. Only 2 small holes remained in the wet ground where its metal stakes had been. I stood there looking at the empty patch of grass longer than I expected. Henry walked over slowly. Glad to see that ugly thing gone, he said. I nodded. Me too. He looked at the gate, then passed it toward the pasture. Your grandfather would have had a few words for anybody trying that. I know. Henry gave me a sideways glance. You handled it cleaner than he might have. That almost made me smile. A few minutes later, Meredith pulled in behind us. She got out carefully, wearing jeans, flat boots, and a gray sweater, no folder in her hand, no phone ready, no argument prepared. Henry tipped his cap to her with polite restraint, then excused himself and drove off, leaving us with the land and the sound of wind moving through the pines. Meredith walked to the gate, but did not touch it. That mattered. A week earlier, she had acted like access and authority were the same thing. Now she waited. I opened the gate myself, and we walked the red clay road in silence. The pasture was still damp, the creek fuller from the rain, the white oak standing at the back trail with its branches wide over the place where my first dog was buried. Meredith stopped near the old tool shed my father had built and ran her fingers along the weathered wood without pressing too hard. I kept calling it empty, she said. I stood a few feet away. It was never empty. She nodded. I know that now. Do you? She turned toward me, eyes tired but steady. I know I wanted the money more than I wanted to understand what the land meant. I know I let Graham make me feel important because he made the sale sound like something I could claim. I know I treated your history like an obstacle. The words did not come quickly. That made them feel less rehearsed. I looked toward the fence line where my grandfather had once shown me how to tighten wire until it sang under his thumb. You also treated my no like a problem to work around. Meredith's face tightened. Yes, that is the part one cannot forget. I am not asking you to forget. The answer surprised me, not because it was enough, but because it did not demand comfort. She looked out across the acres, then back at me. What happens to us now? The question moved through the open field without anything to soften it. I could have answered with anger. I had earned that. I could have answered with a clean ending. Maybe part of me still wanted to. But the land had taught me something this week. Not everything damaged has to be sold, and not everything kept can remain unchanged. We start with legal boundaries, I said. Eleanor is drafting a post-nuptial property acknowledgement. Separate property, trust assets, inheritance, and any future sale authority will be recorded clearly. You will sign it before we discuss anything else. Meredith closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. Okay. And counseling, I added. Not because paperwork fixes trust, but because I need to understand why you thought ambition gave you the right to step over me. Her voice was quiet. Okay. I studied her face, looking for resentment hiding behind compliance. I saw shame, fear, and maybe the first honest willingness to stand still long enough to be accountable. That was not forgiveness, but it was something I could work with if she kept choosing it after the pressure faded. We walked to the white oak together, and I placed one hand on the bark. It was rough, damp, familiar. Meredith stood beside me without speaking. For once, she let the silence belong to the land instead of trying to fill it with plans. In that silence, I felt my grandfather closer than I had all week, not as a ghost, not as a memory demanding revenge, but as a man who had understood that love for family needed protection from the people who might one day confuse opportunity with permission. When we walked back to the gate, Meredith stopped at the empty place where the sign had been. Can I help fill the holes? She asked. I looked at the two small wounds in the ground. Yes, I said. She knelt and pushed wet soil back into them with her hands, slowly, carefully, as if repairing something tiny could teach her how much larger the damage had been. I did not help. I watched. Some repairs have to begin in the hands that made the hole. The morning light spilled across the kitchen counter as I poured 2 cups of coffee, one for me and one for Meredith, neither of us speaking at first. The silence was heavier than the news from the title company, yet it was also a space where we could finally confront the reality we had been avoiding for weeks. Meredith stirred her coffee slowly, her gaze distant, then looked at me with a mix of hesitation and resolve. Do you think this will finally settle everything? She asked quietly. I nodded, trying to measure the weight of that question against the relief that the land was once again secure. It is a start, I said. We walked together to the office where the final documentation had been filed. The papers were crisp and official, each signature a mark of accountability and a boundary drawn clearly between personal ambitions and legal authority. Meredith handled the documents with care, not rushing, aware that each page represented not only a resolution but a lesson in respect and patience. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, the soft rustle a reminder of continuity beyond disputes, beyond misunderstandings. We took a slow walk around the property, noting the healed earth where stakes had been removed and the grass beginning to fill in the tiny wounds. Meredith paused at a familiar spot, her hand brushing the old fence post my grandfather had once shown me how to secure properly. "I can see why this mattered to you," she said, voice low and sincere. I did not answer immediately, letting the wind carry the tension away before speaking. "It always mattered," I said. She nodded, a small but honest gesture, and we continued together, acknowledging that the path forward required patience, communication, and a willingness to prioritize trust over immediate gains. Every step on the damp earth was deliberate, every glance an unspoken commitment to rebuild a foundation stronger than the land itself. By the time we returned to the house, the morning sun had fully risen, illuminating not only the fields and fences, but also the path we would have to walk together, carefully and attentively, understanding that respect, clarity, and shared accountability were the true measures of recovery. Meredith looked at me, finally without hesitation, and said, "I am ready to do this right from now on." I felt the weight of past conflicts lift slightly, replaced by cautious optimism, knowing that this moment, grounded in accountability and understanding, marked a turning point not only for the property, but for our shared future. We left the property that day with a quiet acknowledgement that mistakes had been made, lessons had been learned, and a careful but deliberate effort toward genuine reconciliation had begun, with every decision and every promise rooted in respect, transparency, and a commitment to honor both the land and the trust we owed one another.